The deed was on the table between them, and Jonas Trask had just told her the truth. Maggie Shelton's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment the only sound in the cramped, oil-lamp-lit office of the Redemption Creek Land Registry was the wind screaming off the high desert outside. Her green eyes that had been steady and determined through 4 days of brutal stagecoach travel, through a robbery attempt outside of Tucson, through the sneering disbelief of every man she had approached for help since stepping off that coach, those eyes were finally filling with something that looked dangerously close to tears. Not from grief, from fury. "You knew," she said. The words came out barely above a whisper, which somehow made them more devastating than a shout. "You knew this whole time, and you still let me believe." "I did not let you believe anything," Jonas said, and his voice was rough, scraping against the silence like a boot heel on gravel. He stood up from behind the desk, and he was taller than she had remembered noticing in the days they had traveled together, taller, broader across the shoulders, with that particular stillness that dangerous men carried in their bodies when they were working very hard at not doing something they wanted to do. "I said I would help you find Callaway Flats. I have not yet stopped trying." "Then explain to me why that man," Maggie pointed at the registry clerk, who had gone the color of old chalk and was pressing himself against the far wall like he hoped it might absorb him, "why he just told me that Callaway Flats was burned to the ground 14 years ago. And why, Jonas, you didn't flinch. Not even a little." Jonas met her eyes and said nothing. And in that silence, Maggie Shelton understood that she was in very serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble that came with thieves or bad roads or a deed that named a ghost town. The kind of trouble that came from the fact that she had, over the course of 4 extraordinary days, begun to trust this man completely, and she had no idea who he really was. She pressed both palms flat on the deed, that yellowed, legal-stamped document that her father had pressed into her hands on his deathbed in St. Louis, that paper which had brought her all the way to the Arizona Territory in the spring of 1882, which had upended everything she thought she knew about her life and her inheritance and her future. She lifted her chin and made herself hold his gaze. "Tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Right now." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he folded his large, scarred hands on the table, and he looked at her the way a man looks when he is deciding whether a truth will save something or destroy it. "All right," Jonas Trask said, "but you need to understand that this truth is going to change things." "Things are already changed," Maggie said. "Start talking." 4 days earlier, Maggie Shelton had stepped off the Butterfield stage in Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, with a leather satchel over her shoulder, and a deed folded in the breast pocket of her traveling coat, pressed against her heart the way people carried religious relics. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of composed stubbornness, with dark auburn hair that the desert wind was already making plans to destroy, and a kind of quiet authority in her manner that made people uncertain whether to help her or argue with her. Redemption Creek in the spring of 1882 was a town balanced on the raw edge of civilization. It had a proper post office, a land registry, 2 competing saloons, a church that was also used on Saturdays as a schoolhouse, and a telegraph office that had been working reliably for 3 whole months. It also had red dust that coated everything, a summer heat that was still just warming up its cruelest ambitions, and the particular tension of a frontier community that was growing faster than its laws could keep pace with. Maggie had not planned to need help. Her father, Edmund Shelton, had been a careful man, a St. Louis lawyer who had spent 30 years in meticulous preparation for everything. When he pressed the deed into her hands 11 days ago, 12 hours before the fever finally took him, he had been very specific. The deed was to 120 acres outside Callaway Flats, Arizona Territory, including mineral rights. He had acquired it in 1869, paid for in full, properly recorded. There was a secondary residence built on the property, which he had arranged to be maintained by a caretaker. The caretaker's name was Elias Penn. All Maggie had to do was travel to Callaway Flats, present the deed and her identification, and the property would pass into her ownership without complication. That was what Edmund Shelton had told her. Edmund Shelton had been wrong about nearly every single element of that description, and he had been dead for 11 days, so he could not explain himself. The first problem had been the stagecoach robbery outside Tucson, which had not been a genuine robbery. It had been, Maggie would later understand, someone deliberately trying to acquire the deed. They had taken cash from the other passengers and rifled through bags, and they had been very specifically interested in Maggie's leather satchel, which she had kept on her lap with both arms wrapped around it, and a small but entirely credible derringer pressed against the inside of her coat. The robbers had not gotten the satchel. The second problem had been arriving at Redemption Creek and discovering that nobody had heard of Callaway Flats. Not the stagecoach driver, who had been running this territory for 11 years. Not the man at the post office, who knew every settlement within 200 miles. Not the 3 different people she asked in the first hour of arriving. It was in the 4th hour, standing outside the land registry building with her jaw set, and her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest, that she had first encountered Jonas Trask. He had come around the corner of the building, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who did not owe the world any apologies for taking up space in it. He was 32 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting, several days of stubble that somehow looked intentional rather than neglected, and eyes that were a deep gray-green, the color of river water in shadow, the kind of color that changed depending on what the light was doing. He wore working clothes that were good quality and well used, a hat that had survived considerable weather, and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip that he wore the way men wear things they have forgotten they are carrying because they have carried them so long. He had stopped when he saw her, which was not unusual. Maggie had been stopping men all afternoon with her appearance and her air of compressed, purposeful urgency. What was unusual was that he did not immediately offer help or immediately look away. He simply looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes as if he was reading something complicated. "You look," he said, "like someone who has just been told that the land she's been traveling to find does not exist." Maggie blinked. "That is an oddly specific observation. I watched you ask 4 different people the same question in the last hour," he said, without any particular apology for having watched her. "I know what that expression means. I have worn it myself." "Callaway Flats," she said, because she was not someone who wasted time on pleasantries when there was information to be gathered. "Have you heard of it?" Something moved across his face, too quick and too controlled for her to read it clearly. "I have heard of it," he said. Maggie felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't realized was knotted. "Then you are the first person I have met today who has." "That is probably not a coincidence," he said. She stared at him. "What does that mean?" He glanced at the satchel she was carrying with both hands, as if it contained something more important than her personal effects. He looked back at her face. "It means," he said carefully, "that there are good reasons Callaway Flats is not on the current maps, and those reasons may or may not be connected to whatever it is you are carrying. My name is Jonas Trask. I'm a surveyor by training and currently employed by the Territorial Land Office in an unofficial consulting capacity." "Maggie Shelton," she said. "My father left me a deed to property in Callaway Flats. He died 11 days ago. I am sorry about your father. Are you in a position to help me find the town?" He had studied her for another moment, those unreadable eyes weighing something she could not name. Then he had said, "Yes, I believe I am. And I think you should let me, because whoever tried to take that satchel on the road from Tucson is going to try again." Maggie had gone very still. "I did not tell you about the robbery." "No," he said. "You didn't." That had been the beginning. She had not fully trusted him then. She was not someone who handed trust out quickly, especially not to men in difficult territories who knew things they ought not to know. But she had agreed to work with him, because the alternative was continuing to wander Redemption Creek alone with something that people were apparently willing to commit crimes to obtain, and because, though she would not have admitted this to him or to herself, there was something about Jonas Trask that made her feel, against all practical wisdom, that he was telling her the truth even when he was not telling her everything. They had spent the first evening in the registry office, going through land maps that dated back to the 1860s. Jonas handled the maps with the confidence of someone who had spent years reading terrain, pointing out things she would not have noticed. The way certain roads were marked and then unmarked in successive editions, the way a valley east of the Dragoon Mountains had been labeled differently in different years. He was methodical and patient, and he explained things without condescension, which was something Maggie appreciated more than she could say after a lifetime of men explaining things to her as if she were a slightly slow child. "Here," he said, setting his finger on the 1869 survey map. "Callaway Flats. It's in the valley below the Crane Ridge. It was a mining settlement, silver. The vein played out faster than the speculators wanted, so it never grew past about 200 people, but it had a proper legal existence. There was a land office, formal deeds were issued, everything was above board. And now," Maggie said, "and now," Jonas said, "there is a question about what is there now and who owns the mineral rights to the land below it, and that question has a great deal of money attached to it." Maggie looked at him steadily. "How much money?" He met her eyes. "Enough that people have died over it," he said. "Enough that someone tried to take that deed on the road from Tucson. She absorbed that. You knew about the deed before you met me." He was quiet for a moment that told her everything. "I knew a deed existed," he said carefully. "I did not know who held it, but you were looking." "I was investigating," he said, "on behalf of the Territorial Land Office. There is an ongoing inquiry into the ownership of the Callaway Flats mineral rights, because a company called Crane Ridge Mining has been claiming them since 1876, and there are questions about whether that claim is legitimate." Maggie felt the pieces of something large and complicated beginning to slide together. And if someone held a deed that predated their claim, then the company's entire operation would be legally void, Jonas said. And the person holding that deed would be very wealthy and very vulnerable. He said that last part quietly with a particular weight to it, and Maggie understood that he was not just describing a legal situation. He was warning her. "Is that why you are helping me?" she said. "Because the land office wants the deed." "The land office wants justice," he said, and then, after a pause, "and I want to know the truth. Those are not always the same thing, but in this case I believe they are." She had not entirely believed him, but she had continued working with him. The second day had involved a long ride out toward the Dragoon Mountains, following the coordinates on the deed and cross-referencing them with Jonas's survey maps. Jonas rode with the ease of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than off, and Maggie, who had learned to ride in St. Louis parks and was somewhat out of practice, had kept pace with more dignity than she might have expected, though her legs had strong opinions about the whole enterprise by mid-afternoon. They had talked because the desert was long and the hours were many, and because something about riding through vast empty country with a person loosens the boundaries of conversation in ways that sitting in offices does not. She learned that he was from Texas originally, from a ranching family. That he had studied surveying through an apprenticeship with a civil engineer who had come to build railroads in 1873, and had discovered that he had a gift for reading land, for understanding the geography of a place from maps and from physical observation, for seeing patterns that other people missed. That he had worked for the territorial government for 4 years, mostly on land dispute cases, mostly in areas where settlement and law were still negotiating terms with each other. He did not volunteer information about his past beyond the professional. She noticed this the way she noticed the way he positioned himself whenever they stopped, always with his back to something solid, always aware of the approaches. He was a man who had been in situations where awareness meant survival. She did not press him, partly because she respected the boundary and partly because she was doing her own careful calculation about how much to reveal. She told him about her father, the careful, methodical man whose law office had been her childhood landscape, who had read to her from legal documents as bedtime stories, because that was the library that surrounded him, who had been widowed when Maggie was 8 and had raised her with a kind of quiet, dedicated competence. She told him that she had been her father's legal secretary for the past 6 years, that she understood property law better than most people who had never formally studied it, that the deed her father had given her was legally airtight as far as she could determine. She did not tell him that she was frightened. Not of the robbery, not of the desert, not of the unknown company that was apparently treating the deed as a threat. What frightened her was the possibility that her father's last gift to her, the thing he had pressed into her hands with such urgent, feverish emphasis, the thing he had said would secure her future, might be connected to something dark. That Edmund Shelton, meticulous, careful Edmund, might have acquired that deed in circumstances that were less than clean. She carried that fear the way she carried the deed, close to her chest, carefully concealed, and with a determination not to let it slow her down. They had not found Callaway Flats that day. What they had found, about 4 miles east of where the map indicated the town should be, was evidence that something had been there, the particular quality of ground that had been disturbed long ago and partially reclaimed by desert scrub, the remnants of what might have been a foundation, and the strange geometrical patterns in the earth that Jonas identified as the grid of a street plan, now barely visible beneath 15 years of wind and regrowth. "This is it," Jonas said quietly, standing in the shallow valley and looking at the ground with that reading the land expression that she was beginning to recognize. Or it was. Maggie had stood beside him looking at the ghost of a town and felt something heavy and complicated settle over her. "What happened to it?" "Fire, I believe," he said. "Around 1868, there was a dispute about the mine ownership. It got violent. A significant portion of the town was destroyed. The remaining population scattered to other settlements." He paused. "The legal ownership of the land became murky after that, which is how Crane Ridge Mining was able to move in and assert a claim in 1876. There was enough chaos in the records that no one challenged them effectively." "Until now," Maggie said. "Until now," he agreed. She had looked at him then, standing in the ruins of a place that existed only on a piece of paper she was carrying, and she had felt something shift. Not just in her understanding of the situation, but in herself, in the way she was aware of him. The late afternoon light was doing extraordinary things to the landscape, all red and gold across the desert floor, and Jonas Trask was standing very close to her in the particular silence of a place where something had once been, and she had the sudden, disconcerting awareness that she was in danger of caring about this man's opinion of her, which was inconvenient and unnecessary, and she told herself firmly, merely a product of the stress of the situation and the dramatic setting. She had turned back to the deed. The third day had been harder, though not in the ways she had anticipated. They had ridden back toward Redemption Creek by a different route, and Jonas had taken her to meet a man named Harlan Cord, who lived in a crumbling adobe house at the edge of a dry creek bed, and was the most reliably informed person in the territory regarding land disputes and their histories. Harlan was 70 years old, almost completely deaf in one ear, and possessed of a memory like a bank vault for anything involving property, money, and grievance. He had taken one look at the deed, then at Maggie, then at Jonas, and said, "Edmund Shelton's girl, I wondered if you'd ever come." Maggie had felt the world shift under her. "You knew my father, knew of him," Harlan said, with the precise distinction of a man who valued accuracy. "Edmund Shelton bought that deed in 1869 from a man named Calvin Prout. Prout was the original landowner, had the mineral rights deeded to him directly from the territorial government in 1866, right and proper. He was selling because he needed money fast and couldn't wait for the mine to produce. Shelton bought it as an investment, intending to develop it. Then the fire happened. Was my father involved in the fire? Maggie said, and her voice was level and her hands were steady, because she had spent 4 days preparing herself for the possibility that the answer to this question was yes. Harlan looked at her steadily. No, he said. Edmund Shelton had nothing to do with the fire. He was in St. Louis when it happened. He'd been trying to organize investment capital for months, and he was nowhere near this territory. The fire was the work of the Crane Ridge people, or the men who would become the Crane Ridge people. They wanted the land, they wanted the mine, and they were willing to use brutal methods to get what they wanted. Shelton got word of it and went quiet about his ownership because he was a lawyer, not a gunfighter, and he had a young daughter, and he was not stupid. Maggie breathed out slowly. She had not realized how much of her had been braced for the opposite answer. But he kept the deed, she said. He kept the deed, Harlan confirmed. And he kept records of Crane Ridge's activities over the years. There's more than just the deed, miss. Your father compiled a record of what they did. He sent copies to 3 separate people for safekeeping. I have one set. The Territorial Land Registry in Santa Fe has another. And the third, he looked at Jonas. Jonas reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded set of documents. Is here, he said. Your father sent them to the Territorial Land Office 18 months ago with a letter explaining that he was ill and would be sending his heir to claim the property. He asked us to assist. Maggie stared at him. The betrayal hit her before the understanding did, the sharp, furious feeling of having been managed. You knew all of this, she said, in a voice that was completely quiet and very precise. From the beginning. You knew who I was, why I was here, what I was carrying. I knew some of it, Jonas said, and the carefully level quality of his voice told her that he knew exactly how badly this was landing and he was not going to flinch from it. I knew your father's name was connected to the Callaway Flats inquiry. I did not know the details of his documentation or how solid the legal case was, and I did not know you. That last part is supposed to matter. I think it does, he said quietly. I hope it does. She had not spoken to him on the ride back to town. She had been processing, sorting through everything she knew and everything she had assumed and everything she felt, which was complicated by the fact that underneath the very legitimate anger was something else, something that had been growing quietly over 3 days and did not have a simple name, which brought her to the 4th day and the land registry office, and the moment she had arrived at with her palms flat on the deed and the demand that he tell her everything. He did. He told her that the land office had been trying to build a case against Crane Ridge Mining for 3 years, but that they lacked the essential element, the original deed, which established that the mineral rights had never legally lapsed. Without it, Crane Ridge could claim their 1876 filing was valid, because there was no prior recorded interest to contest it. He told her that Edmund Shelton's documentation, the records of the fire, of the intimidation of witnesses, of the falsification of land records that Crane Ridge had engaged in over the years, was compelling but not sufficient on its own. He told her that the deed she was carrying, combined with those records and her testimony as Edmund Shelton's heir and executor, was enough to bring the entire thing crashing down. It was enough to legally extinguish Crane Ridge's claim, restore the property to her, and trigger a formal investigation that would likely result in criminal charges against the company's principals. He told her that the robbery outside Tucson had been organized by a man named Denton Hayes, who was Crane Ridge's field agent in the territory, and who had known Maggie was coming, because she had told the St. Louis Post Office she was traveling to Arizona, and the St. Louis Post Office had a clerk on Crane Ridge's payroll. He told her that he had been positioned outside the land registry that first afternoon not by coincidence, but because he had known she would likely go there, and that his intention had been to identify her, assess whether she was genuine, and then present himself in a way that allowed her to make her own choice about working with him. You staged the encounter, she said. I positioned myself, he said. That is not the same thing. Everything I told you was true. Everything I said I would do, I have done. You withheld significant information. Yes, he said without qualification. I did, because I needed to understand whether you were who you appeared to be, and I needed you to trust me based on what I did rather than what I claimed. If I had walked up to you on that street and said I am a government investigator, and your father left us documents, and I knew you were coming, what would you have done? Maggie was silent, because the honest answer was that she would have walked away from him immediately and trusted no one. I had a hidden agenda, Jonas said, and he said it the way someone says something they have been carrying in their chest and are finally setting down. That is the truth, and I am sorry for it, because you deserved honesty from the beginning, and the fact that my reasons were legitimate does not change what it felt like to you when you found out. She looked at him across the table for a long, charged moment. What happens now? She said. Now, Jonas said, we go to the district land office in Tombstone with the deed and your father's documentation, and we file a formal contest of Crane Ridge's claim. We do it quickly because Denton Hayes is not going to give up, and we are safer with this in official hands than we are holding on to it out here. She said. If you will still work with me, he said. You have every right not to. I can arrange a safe escort to Tombstone regardless of whether you want me present. The choice is yours. She looked at him. She thought about the past 4 days, the way he had handled the maps, the way he had spoken to Harlan Cord with respect, the way he had ridden through the desert explaining things without making her feel like a subordinate. She thought about the way he had positioned himself, those first hours, so that he was always between her and the most likely direction of approach. She thought about the fact that when she had asked him direct questions, he had never lied to her. He had been incomplete. He had managed the timing of information, but he had not, as far as she could determine, told her a single false thing. She also thought about the way the late afternoon light had looked in that ghost valley, and the way he had stood beside her in the silence of it, and the way she had been aware of him in a manner that had nothing to do with the deed or the legal case or the territorial government. I will work with you, she said. But from this point forward, you tell me everything you know as soon as you know it. No more management, no more timing of revelations. I am not a witness you are shepherding. I am a full participant. Something shifted in his face, something that might have been relief or admiration or both. Agreed, he said. And Jonas? Yes. If there are any more secrets hiding in that coat of yours, she said, now would be the time. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth that suggested smiling was something he had once known how to do and was relearning. Nothing else, he said. You have everything. She nodded and folded the deed back into her breast pocket, close to her heart where she had been carrying it all along. They left for Tombstone the next morning before sunrise. The ride to Tombstone in the spring of 1882 was not a trivial undertaking. It was roughly 80 miles from Redemption Creek by the most direct route, through terrain that varied from navigable hardpan to genuinely challenging mountain passes, and the most recent news from Tombstone itself, which was the county seat and the largest silver mining hub in the territory, was that the town was in a period of considerable instability. The events of the previous October, the gunfight at the OK Corral and the complicated violence that had followed it through the winter, had left Tombstone with a raw, unsettled quality that even the most optimistic reports acknowledged. But the district land office was in Tombstone. The federal judge with jurisdiction over land disputes held court in Tombstone, and Jonas had a contact there, a man named Whitfield, the district land registrar, whom he trusted and who had been expecting them. They rode with 2 additional people, a young deputy named Sam Escobar, who was 23 and had been assigned by the Redemption Creek town marshal to accompany them, and a woman named Clara Reyes, who was Harlan Cord's granddaughter and who was traveling to Tombstone for her own purposes, and who had accepted Jonas's offer to ride with a protected party with a pragmatic efficiency that Maggie, immediately recognized and appreciated. Clara was 28, compact and watchful, and she and Maggie had taken to each other with the swift, comfortable ease of women who recognized in each other a fundamental competence. By the second hour of riding, they were talking with the relaxed candor of people who had known each other much longer, which was partly the desert horizon effect, and partly the fact that they were both, in their different ways, accustomed to navigating a world that frequently underestimated them. "He watches you," Clara said to Maggie, at a point when Jonas and Sam had ridden ahead to check the trail at a ridge crossing. Maggie kept her eyes on the trail. "He watches everything. He is a surveyor." "Observation is professional habit. He watches everything," Clara agreed, "but he watches you differently." "Differently how?" Clara considered this with the seriousness she gave most questions. "Like someone who has found a landmark they didn't know they were looking for," she said finally, "and now keeps checking to make sure it's still there." Maggie had nothing to say to that, partly because it was unexpectedly beautiful as a description, and partly because she was not prepared to examine what she felt about it. The first night of the journey they camped in the shelter of a canyon wall, a proper camp with a fire, and the supplies Jonas had organized in Redemption Creek with the thoroughness of a man who did not leave survival to chance. He had brought enough food for 5 days, bedrolls, medical supplies, and enough ammunition to be taking the threat from Denton Hayes seriously, without being theatrical about it. Sam Escobar turned out to be a young man of considerable warmth and moderately limited experience, who compensated for the second quality with genuine enthusiasm for the first, and he made the evening's conversation easy with stories about his early months of deputying in Redemption Creek that were funny and occasionally genuinely harrowing. Clara contributed dry observations that made Sam laugh. Maggie felt herself relax by degrees, the accumulated tension of 5 days settling out of her shoulders. Jonas was quieter than the others. He was always somewhat quieter than the others. It was not unfriendliness. It was more that he had the quality of someone whose default mode was listening and observation rather than speech, who spoke when he had something specific to say, and was comfortable with silence in a way that some people found unnerving and Maggie was finding, with each day, less unnerving and more like standing near a fire. Steady, constant, warm in a way that did not announce itself. After Sam and Clara had rolled into their bedrolls and the fire had burned low, Jonas and Maggie sat on opposite sides of the remaining embers without speaking for a time that was long enough to have been uncomfortable with anyone else and was not. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "The land office work." 4 years of official work," he said. "Before that, in Texas, I was involved in some disputes that were less official." He paused. "My family lost land when I was 19. A cattle company moved in with a legal claim that was manufactured forged records, bought witnesses. My father spent 3 years fighting it through legitimate channels and ran out of money before he ran out of right. We lost the ranch." Maggie was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Is that why you do this?" "Partly," he said. "It is also the work I am genuinely suited to. The reading of maps, the understanding of how land and law connect and disconnect. It matters to me in ways that most other work has not." He paused again. "And I believe the law should be what it claims to be. That if something is documented and proper and rightfully owned, it should be protected. That is not always how it goes, but working toward it seems worth the effort." "My father believed the same thing," Maggie said. "He had a phrase he used. He said the law is only just when someone insists that it be." "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," she said. The grief came briefly, the way it did in small, specific surges rather than a constant flood, and she let it pass without concealing it, which was easier out here under the enormous dark sky than it would have been in a registry office. "He would have liked you, I think. He appreciated people who took their work seriously and did not require applause for it." Jonas looked at her across the dying fire and said nothing, but there was something in the way he was looking at her that she had no language for and did not try to find one. "We should sleep," he said. Early start. Yes, she agreed, and did not move for another few minutes, and neither did he. The second day of the ride was when Denton Hayes found them. He did not find them the way she might have expected, not a dramatic ambush with armed men charging across the hardpan, though she was later told this had been the original plan. Instead, 3 of Hayes's men simply appeared on the trail ahead, blocking it, while a fourth materialized at the rear, cutting off retreat. It was a clean, professional operation, which told her that whoever Denton Hayes employed, he employed them with some care. The man in front was not Hayes himself. He was a hired hand named Briggs who had the particular flat-affect quality of someone who had done this sort of work many times and felt nothing about it. He addressed Jonas rather than Maggie, which was a mistake that told her quite a bit about his assumptions. "We just need the document the lady's carrying," Briggs said. "Give us that and you can all go on to wherever you're headed with no trouble." "No," Jonas said. He had not reached for his gun. He was sitting very still on his horse with that particular stillness, and Maggie had the impression that this was not stillness born of fear. "That's not really a negotiating position," Briggs said. "It is the only position I have," Jonas said. "That deed belongs to Miss Shelton by right of inheritance and is the subject of an active territorial land inquiry. Any interference with her or with it is a federal matter. You are 4 men making a very poor decision. We were told there were 4 of you." "That is correct," Jonas said. There was a moment, a held breath in the desert air, and then Sam Escobar from behind and to the left said, "I'm a deputized officer of the Redemption Creek Town Marshal's office, and I am formally notifying you that you are obstructing federal business, which I encourage you to consider seriously." Sam's voice had a slight tremble in it that was entirely understandable given the circumstances. But the words were right and the gun was out, and Maggie noted, leveled with reasonable steadiness. The 4 men did some rapid calculation. Then they moved aside. It was not satisfying in the way that confrontations in stories are satisfying. It was practical and quiet and over in 2 minutes, and then they were riding again, and Maggie was aware that her hands were absolutely steady on the reins while her heart was doing something considerably less steady in her chest. "That's going to happen again," Jonas said quietly to her, riding close enough that only she could hear. "Hayes is not going to let the same approach fail twice." "I know," she said. "I need you to trust me about how we handle what comes next." She looked at him sideways. "I thought we agreed full participants, equal information, no management." "I am not managing you," he said. "I am asking you to trust my read on what Hayes will try because I have dealt with men like Hayes before and you have not. The way this works between us does not require me to pretend I do not have knowledge you lack." She thought about that for a moment. "Fair," she said. "What will he try next?" "He will come himself," Jonas said, "and he will use something other than force." He was right. Hayes came himself in Tombstone and he used a lawyer. They arrived in Tombstone on the afternoon of the 3rd day of riding, the 6th day of Maggie's time in the territory. Tombstone in the spring of 1882 was everything and nothing like what she had heard. It was alive with the specific energy of a place that was simultaneously booming and recovering, the silver mine still producing, the political situation still inflamed from the previous year's violence, the streets full of working men and gamblers and business people, and a constant low-level current of tension that made the air feel slightly charged. Jonas took them directly to the land registry office, which was a proper government building on Allen Street, and to Whitfield, a compact, serious man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the deeply calloused handshake of someone who had spent 30 years handling documents in rough conditions. Whitfield looked at the deed. He read every line of it 3 times. He compared it against the documentation Jonas had carried. He looked up Maggie's father's name in his own records and found the letter Edmund Shelton had sent 18 months ago, which had been filed and waited in its folder for exactly this moment. "This is legitimate," he said. "This predates the Crane Ridge claim by 7 years and the mineral rights transfer is legal and documented. There is no gap in the chain of ownership." He took off his spectacles and looked at Maggie directly with something that was close to respect. "Your father was very careful, Miss Shelton." "He was," she said, and her voice stayed level. "I will begin the formal filing today," Whitfield said. "The judge with jurisdiction, Judge Hartley, is in Tombstone this week. I can get this in front of him within 2 days. Once he reviews it and signs the recognition of prior claim, Crane Ridge's entire operation is subject to immediate suspension pending investigation." It was at that point that Denton Hayes's lawyer walked through the door. He was a very good lawyer. Maggie could see that immediately from the way he moved through the space and the quality of his suit and the particular confidence of a man who was accustomed to turning legal moments in the direction he was paid to turn them. His name was Aldous Prentice, and he represented Crane Ridge Mining Company, and he had in his hand a counterfiling that he claimed preempted everything they had just submitted. The counterfiling was an instrument Maggie had never encountered before, which was called a declaration of abandonment, and it claimed that Edmund Shelton had formally abandoned his interest in the Callaway Flats property in 1872, terminating his deed's legal force. Maggie looked at it. She read it carefully, and then she said with absolute conviction, "This is a forgery." Prentice was smoothly unperturbed. "That is a bold claim, Miss Shelton." "It is an accurate claim," she said. "My father's signature on this document is wrong. His capital E had a particular way of looping, a consistent characteristic across 30 years of documents. This is an approximation. Someone studied his signature without having access to sufficient examples." She looked at Whitfield. "Compare it to the letter he sent you 18 months ago." Whitfield got the letter out. He put it beside the declaration of abandonment. He looked for several long seconds. "She's right," he said quietly. Prentice had, for the first time, a slightly less smooth expression. "Furthermore," Maggie said, pressing the advantage with the focused energy of someone who had grown up watching her father work, "the notarial seal on this document is from a Prescott office that I can verify against the Arizona Territorial Notary Registry, did not open until 1874, 2 years after the date on this supposed abandonment. And if Whitfield will check the county seal number against the official register, I believe he will find that number was not issued until 1875 at the earliest." The silence in the room had a quality to it that Maggie recognized from her father's best courtroom moments, the held-breath stillness of people watching something inevitable unfold. Whitfield checked the county seal number. 1875, he said. "The seal is from 1875. I believe," Maggie said to Prentice in a voice that was entirely pleasant, "that you have just presented a forged document to a federal land registrar. I also believe that you are going to want to speak to whoever at Crane Ridge provided you with this document because they have put you in a very uncomfortable position." Prentice left. He did not say anything further. He simply gathered the documents and left with the swift, efficient walk of a man who needed to reassess his situation immediately. Jonas was standing to her right, and she became aware that he had not moved throughout the entire exchange, had simply remained exactly where he was, close enough to be present, far enough back to let her work, and when she looked at him his expression was something she had no previous experience reading on a human face. It was not admiration exactly, though it contained that. It was something more like recognition, as if he were seeing something he had suspected and was now certain of. "That," he said very quietly, "was extraordinary. My father taught me to read documents," she said. "He said the truth is always in the details." "He was right," Jonas said. The filing went forward that afternoon. Whitfield submitted everything to Judge Hartley's clerk. The judge reviewed the material that evening and, by the following morning, had signed a preliminary recognition of prior claim, which meant that Crane Ridge's operation at the Callaway Flats site was immediately suspended pending full proceedings. It was not completely over. The full proceedings would take months, and Crane Ridge would fight it, and Denton Hayes was still somewhere in Tombstone and was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. But the critical moment had passed. The deed was filed. The documentation was in official hands. The legal protection of a federal court order was now in place. That evening, Maggie sat in the window of the room she had taken at Tombstone's Grand Hotel, a respectable establishment on Fifth Street that was significantly more comfortable than the previous 2 nights of desert camping, and looked out at the lights of the town and felt something very strange happen inside her chest. It was the specific decompression of someone who has been operating at maximum tension for days and has suddenly been told they can breathe normally. And it was both a relief and a little frightening, because when the emergency was over there was space for things she had been keeping carefully crowded out. There was a knock at her door. "It is Jonas," he said from the other side. She let him in, leaving the door open as propriety required, and he stood in the doorway rather than coming into the room, which she appreciated, and said, "I wanted you to know. Sam just got a telegraph from the Redemption Creek Marshal. Hayes left Tombstone this afternoon heading east. He's gone." "Good," she said. "I also wanted to say something else." She waited. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and the evening light coming through the window was doing something warm to his face, and she had the feeling she had been having for days, the feeling she had been refusing to fully acknowledge, rising now with the particular irresistibility of something that has been damned for too long. "I know this began as something I managed on my own terms," he said, "and I know that is not something I can simply undo by saying I regret the approach. But I want to be honest with you about what the last week has been for me, because I think you deserve that honesty, and because—" He stopped. He was not a man who struggled with words often, which made the struggle remarkable. "Because I think I would like to know you past the end of this particular situation, and I understand if that is not something you want, but I could not let you settle into thinking that the interest I have taken has been purely professional." Maggie looked at him standing in her doorway, this complicated, careful, essentially decent man, who had managed her introduction to the truth with methods she could not entirely approve and intentions she could not find fault with. And she felt the thing she had been not naming for days settle into something with an actual name. "I would like to know you past the end of this situation," she said carefully, "but I want it to be an honest knowing, no more strategic information management." "None," he said. "And I want it to be slow," she said. "Not because I am uncertain, because I have learned this week that I am bad at trusting quickly, and I am learning that this is not always a flaw." Something happened in his expression that was the most fully open thing she had seen on his face, something unguarded and genuine, and she realized, quietly joyful. "Slow suits me," he said. "I have spent a lot of my life moving fast from one emergency to the next. I would not mind doing something slowly for once." She nodded. He said good night. He left, and Maggie Shelton sat in her window above the Tombstone night and felt something she could only identify as hope spreading through her chest like sunlight through a clear morning. The formal legal proceedings took 4 months. It was not a simple 4 months. Crane Ridge Mining did not concede without a considerable fight. They hired 3 more lawyers and challenged the provenance of the deed itself, requiring expert testimony about document dating and handwriting that Maggie found, to her private satisfaction, that she was exceptionally qualified to assist with. She worked alongside Whitfield and the territorial attorney for 2 months in Tombstone and then in Prescott, building the case with the meticulous, evidence-by-evidence methodology she had learned at her father's side. Jonas was there for most of it, though his role shifted. He had provided his survey expertise to the court to establish the physical boundaries of the original claim and to document what Crane Ridge had actually built and extracted on the land during their years of illegal occupation. He spent weeks in the field, producing survey reports of a quality that Judge Hartley's clerk later described as the most thorough land documentation he had seen in 20 years of territorial court work. They were not in the same city for large portions of those 4 months, which was genuinely difficult in ways that surprised Maggie with their intensity. She had not expected to miss him so specifically, Not his company in general, but the particular quality of it, the steadiness and the dry humor, and the way he could say more with silence than most people said with a great many words. They wrote to each other. Long letters, by the standards of practical correspondence. Jonas's handwriting was clear and precise, like his maps, and he described what he was seeing in the field with a detail and a feeling that she had not anticipated from him, as if the writing opened something in him that face-to-face caution kept closed. She wrote back with equal length and equal candor, and discovered that she had things to say to him that she had not been able to say to anyone else since her father died, things about her grief and her uncertainty, and the strange process of building a life on the foundation of someone else's careful planning. He came back to Tombstone in July when his survey work was complete, and the first evening they were in the same city again, they had dinner at the best restaurant in Tombstone, which was not saying very much about the restaurant, but the company made it irrelevant. 3 hours passed before either of them was aware that much time had gone by. "You are different in person than in letters," she said. "Better or worse?" "Different," she said firmly, and then, "Both, depending on the subject." That is either a compliment or a critique delivered with unusual efficiency. "It is an observation," she said. "You are more careful in person, more controlled. In letters you said things you would not have said face to face." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I know, the distance makes it easier." "I noticed," she said. "I did not mind it, it told me things." "What did it tell you?" She looked at him across the table. "That you are as careful about what matters to you as you are about everything else," she said, "and that what is in those letters matters to you." He held her gaze without speaking, and in the silence she felt the truth of what they were to each other become something solid and undeniable. "It matters to me very much," he said. He walked her back to her boarding house that night. She had moved to a more economical arrangement than the Grand Hotel. Once it became clear the proceedings would be long, and at the door he took her hand. Not dramatically, simply took it in both of his large, careful hands and held it for a moment. "Maggie," he said, "I want to say something without managing how I say it or timing it for the right moment, because you have made me understand that timing and management are not the same as honesty." "Say it," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for longer than I was consciously willing to admit. And I am telling you now because you deserve to know it, not because the circumstances are ideal or because I have calculated the right moment. The circumstances are not ideal, and I do not know if this is the right moment, but those considerations are not why I am telling you. I am telling you because it is true, and you should know what is true." Maggie stood in the soft, improbable Tombstone night with her hand in his, and felt something enormous and completely terrifying open in her chest, the kind of feeling that made a person understand why people sometimes ran from it. She did not run. "I know it is true," she said, "because I am in love with you too. And I have been refusing to be certain about it because certainty felt like a risk I was not ready for. But I am," she stopped, started again. "I am ready." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it, not the courtly gesture it might have looked like from outside, but something that meant everything. He looked at her over the hand he was holding, and his eyes had that quality they had in the ghost valley of Callaway Flats, in the late afternoon light that first day of riding, open in a way she had never seen a person's eyes be open. "Slow," he said. "Slow," she agreed. He let her hand go. She went inside. She stood in her room for a very long time without moving, feeling the specific joy of a thing that has been true for a while finally being allowed to exist fully. The verdict came down in September. Judge Hartley ruled in favor of Maggie Shelton. The ruling was comprehensive. The Callaway Flats deed was declared valid, and the chain of title from Calvin Prout to Edmund Shelton to Margaret Catherine Shelton was formally established. Crane Ridge Mining's 1876 claim was invalidated in its entirety. The company was ordered to pay restitution for the value of minerals extracted from the property during the years of their illegal occupation, which was a sum that Maggie, who had become intimately familiar with the mine's production records during the proceedings, knew to be substantial. Two of Crane Ridge's principals faced criminal indictment for fraud and conspiracy. Denton Hayes, who had fled the territory entirely sometime in August, was wanted on related charges but had not been located by the time the verdict was rendered. He was, Whitfield told Maggie with a certain satisfaction, unlikely to return. The restitution, combined with the value of the land itself and the continuing mineral rights, meant that Maggie Shelton was, as of that September morning in Judge Hartley's Tombstone courtroom, a woman of considerable independent means. She sat in the courtroom after the room had emptied and Jonas had gone to speak with Whitfield, and she thought about her father, about Edmund Shelton, who had bought this deed as an investment and been too frightened of violent men to claim it openly, who had spent 14 years maintaining records and preparing documentation and waiting for a moment that did not come in his lifetime but came in hers. She thought about what it cost a careful, principled man to be afraid, to have a right and not be able to assert it because the world he lived in made assertion dangerous. She thought that she was grateful for the right and grateful for the records, and grateful that he had raised her to be the kind of person who could walk into that courtroom and fight for it. She also thought that she hoped, wherever he was, he knew it was done. Jonas found her there 20 minutes later, sitting in the empty courtroom with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the high windows. He sat down beside her without saying anything, which was exactly right. They sat together for a while in the quiet. "What do you want to do now?" he said finally. "I want to see the land," she said. "I want to go out there and actually stand on it, not as someone looking for something, just as the person it belongs to." "I can take you," he said. "I know you can," she said, and then, "Jonas, what do you want from here, from what comes after this?" He was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone choosing words carefully because the words matter. "I want to stay in this territory," he said. "The work here is real, and there is more of it to do. There are other disputes, other people with legitimate claims that are being buried under manufactured paperwork and intimidation. I would like to keep doing it. Here, not Texas. Texas is the past," he said. "Arizona is the present." He paused. "I would like very much for my present to include you, in whatever form you want that to take. If that means," he stopped, began again. "I am not going to manage this conversation. I am going to say directly that if you will marry me, I would be a grateful man for the rest of my life. And if you need more time, I will wait as long as you need. And if the answer is no, I will understand it and respect it and still consider this year the best year of my life." Maggie turned to look at him in the empty courtroom, with the September light coming through those high windows and falling across his face, and she thought about all the ways the past 4 months had confirmed what that first week had begun. The letters, and the careful conversation, and the way he listened with his whole attention, and the way he asked her opinion on things and treated the answer as information rather than performance, and the way he had stood back and let her dismantle Prentice's forgery in that registry office without trying to interject or manage it or take credit for it after. She thought about the kind of life that could be built by two people who both believed the truth was in the details and that rights were worth insisting on. She thought that it was a very good kind of life. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and the joy in them was so unguarded that it changed his whole face, made him younger, made him the version of himself that had probably existed before the things he had been through had taught him to keep himself so contained. "Yes," he said, as if checking that he had heard correctly. "Yes," she said again, "I will marry you, Jonas Trask. And I am not going to manage the timing of saying that I am very happy about it, because you have made me understand that timing is not the same as honesty. I am very happy." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him fully laugh, and it was a good sound, low and genuine and a little surprised, as if happiness sometimes caught him off guard because he had not expected enough of it. He took her hand, and they sat together in the courtroom where the thing had just been decided, and outside the windows the September sun was making the Arizona territory gold. They went out to Callaway Flats 3 weeks later. The four of them, Maggie and Jonas, Clara Reyes, who had become a genuine friend over the course of the summer, and had, with characteristic practical efficiency, established herself as someone whose counsel Maggie valued enormously. And a local man named Reese, who Jonas hired to assist with the physical assessment of the property, rode out on a bright October morning when the desert had started its autumn transformation, and the light had that particular crystalline quality of a territory that has decided to be beautiful. The valley below Crane Ridge was not the ghost it had been when Maggie first saw it in April. The mine operation that Crane Ridge had built was extensive machinery, shaft structures, a processing facility, a small cluster of workers' buildings. The legal order had stopped the operation, and the workers had left, and there was a stillness over it that was neither mournful nor menacing but simply quiet. The machinery would be assessed for restitution value. The infrastructure could be repurposed or removed. The decisions were Maggie's. She walked the ground with Jonas beside her, letting him read the terrain aloud to her as he always did, the way the valley collected water in spring, the orientation of the ridge that would give the mine structures afternoon shade, the quality of the soil in the flat section to the west where the original town of Callaway Flats had been, which was excellent for certain crops. Mineral rights are one thing, he said, but this valley is good land. There is water access. The elevation moderates the heat. Someone could build something lasting here. She looked around at the valley and the ridge and the enormous Arizona sky, and thought about her father buying this deed as an investment and never being able to use it, and thought about all the different futures this place had almost been, and about what she wanted it to be. Someone will, she said. The wedding was in Tombstone in November, 1882, at the church on Toughnut Street. A simple, genuine ceremony without extravagance or performance, which suited both of them exactly. Whitfield gave her away, which she had not expected him to offer and which moved her considerably when he did. Clara stood beside her. Sam Escobar, who had developed a mild hero worship of Jonas over the course of the summer that he managed with great dignity, stood beside Jonas. A good portion of the Territorial Land Office attended, as did Judge Hartley, who shook her hand afterward and told her she had the finest legal mind he had encountered in 20 years of territorial practice, which she accepted as the compliment it was, and suspected he meant as more than that. Jonas looked at her during the ceremony with that completely open expression, the unguarded one, the one she had first seen in the full measure of it when she said yes in the courtroom, and she thought she would carry that look for the rest of her life. "You are extraordinary," he told her quietly afterward, when the formal part was done and before the reception, which was held at the best restaurant in Tombstone, which had improved since July on account of a new cook, which Maggie had felt was an optimistic omen when she learned of it. "I am well documented," she said. "There is a difference." He laughed and shook his head and kissed her for the first time fully, without the doorstep restraint of the past months, and she decided that she had been thoroughly correct to say yes. They spent that first night in the Grand Hotel, and the desert winter settled gentle and cold over Tombstone, and Maggie Shelton, who was now Maggie Trask, though she kept Shelton as well, which Jonas supported without reservation on the grounds that it was her name and her right, felt the particular peace of someone who has done a hard and necessary thing, and arrived at the other side of it intact and better than they were at the beginning. Through the winter, they worked on the plans for the Callaway Flats property. Maggie made decisions about the mine with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She engaged a mining engineer to assess the shaft's remaining viability, the results of which suggested the vein, while not as productive as the Crane Ridge promotional materials had claimed, was not exhausted and could generate a steady, if modest, income under properly managed operation. She contracted with a Tucson firm to manage the operation, with terms that included fair wages for the workers and quarterly review of the financial reports by herself. She was her father's daughter in this as in everything. She read every document, she verified every figure, she trusted but she verified. Jonas, meanwhile, had formalized his position with the Territorial Land Office into something with an actual title and an actual salary: senior survey consultant for land dispute resolution, which he accepted with the characteristic absence of enthusiasm for his own status and complete enthusiasm for the work itself. His first case after the Callaway Flats matter was settled was the investigation of a disputed water rights claim in the San Pedro River Valley that would occupy him for the better part of the following year. They set up their household in Tombstone to begin with, because the work kept them there, in a proper house on 4th Street with 3 rooms, and a garden that Maggie planted with an ambition that the Tombstone soil rewarded more than she had expected. She had not known she had opinions about gardening until she acquired land, and she discovered that growing things appealed to her in the same way that building legal cases did: the patient, evidence-based progression toward a result that could not be hurried. Clara Reyes came for dinner most weeks, and she and Maggie continued the conversation that the desert road had begun. A conversation that ranged widely and returned often to the subject of what women could and could not do in the territory of 1882 and 1883, and what they were doing regardless. Clara was running her grandfather Harlan Cord's affairs with increasing effectiveness as his health declined, which involved more land documentation work than she had anticipated, and Maggie found herself providing informal legal analysis on several occasions that made her think seriously about what it would mean to formalize that practice. Spring brought the first good news from the Callaway Flats mine, a quarterly report showing exactly the steady, moderate productivity she had projected, running cleanly within the terms of the management contract. It also brought a letter from a settlement 20 miles north of Callaway Flats, in the same valley system, where a group of farming families had been attempting for 3 years to secure water rights that a cattle operation had been contesting, and who had heard word traveled in particular ways in the territory, that Maggie Trask was someone who understood how to read a deed. She wrote back. They corresponded for a month. In May of 1883, she rode out with Jonas to the settlement and spent 4 days going through their documentation. Their case was sound. Their records were incomplete in specific ways she could help them address. She wrote the formal contest of the cattle operation's water rights claim, filed it in Tombstone, and watched it work its way through the system with the patience of someone who knew exactly how long these things took. The case was resolved in their favor 8 months later, which was faster than anyone had expected. Maggie considered that a promising sign. By the summer of 1883, she knew she was pregnant, and she told Jonas on a Sunday morning in their 4th Street house, sitting across the kitchen table from him over coffee, the way they started every morning they were in the same city. She said it simply and directly, because that was how they talked, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something mattered to him beyond his usual calibrated composure. The shift to complete openness, the specific unguarded joy. He came around the table and held her, and she let herself be held without reservation, which was something she had been learning to do over the past year with him, to let down the composed self-sufficiency without feeling that she was diminishing herself in the process. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I want to keep working." "Of course," he said, without any of the demurral she might have expected. "Tell me what you need." What she needed was mostly what she already had: the work, the household, the company of Jonas and Clara, and the particular rhythm their life had developed. She reduced her writing considerably as her pregnancy advanced, which she resented on purely practical grounds, and compensated by conducting a significant amount of her legal analysis work through correspondence, which expanded her reach considerably. By the time winter came, she had informal consulting relationships with 3 separate parties in active land disputes, none of whom had originally planned to ask a woman for legal analysis, and all of whom had discovered that this was a poor way of screening for competence. The baby came in January of 1884, in the house on 4th Street, with a doctor named Pryor who was the best in Tombstone and a midwife named Maria who was better than the doctor, and who Clara had identified and secured 3 months earlier. The labor was not easy, but it was not dangerous, and at the end of it Jonas, who had been pacing the room and sitting and standing, and generally failing at his usual composure for 6 hours, was brought in and handed his son. He stood with the baby in his arms and looked at him the way he had looked at Maggie in the courtroom, with that completely open expression, and did not say anything for a long time. "Edmund," Maggie said from the bed, watching him. "I want to call him Edmund." Jonas looked at her, and the depth of feeling in his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life, as clearly as the moment in the courtroom, as clearly as the ceremony on Toughnut Street, as clearly as the first time she had fully understood that this man was not going to hurt her. "Edmund Jonas Trask," he said. "Yes," she agreed. Edmund was a large, determined baby who had opinions about nearly everything and the lung capacity to express them, which Maggie found completely characteristic, and Jonas found something between alarming and deeply charming. He was a child who wanted to understand how things worked. From very early on, he was more interested in examining objects than playing with them, taking them apart to see what was inside, which was a quality both his parents recognized without surprise. Clara was his devoted godmother and treated him with the combination of genuine affection and refusal to be manipulated that Edmund respected from infancy onward. Life settled into a pattern that was not without difficulty, but was deeply good. Jonas's work took him into the field for weeks at a time through the spring and summer, which Maggie managed by remaining in full communication via telegraph and letter, a system that worked because they had both become very good at saying what mattered in writing. When he came home from a long survey trip, the first evening was always the best, the specific pleasure of reunion that people who are not often enough in the same place learn to treasure. The Callaway Flats mine continued to produce steadily. The farming settlement north of the valley had their water rights secured, and their crops improved. Maggie's reputation as someone who could read a land document with both legal rigor and practical wisdom spread through the territory in the organic way that useful skills spread when they are reliably excellent and consistently available. In 1885, when Edmund was 14 months old and pulling himself along the furniture with magnificent confidence, a Tombstone attorney named Paulson approached Maggie about formalizing her practice. Paulson had been practicing in the territory for 15 years and had built a solid office, but he was overwhelmed with land dispute work, and he had been watching Maggie's results for 2 years with the admiration of someone who recognizes a better practitioner. "I am not technically qualified to practice law in the territory," Maggie said, because she was always precise about what was and was not the case. "You could be," Paulson said, "territorial bar examination. You would pass it without difficulty, based on what I have seen, and I would be honored to sponsor your application." She thought about it for a week. She talked to Jonas, who said it was entirely her decision, but that his opinion, if she wanted it, was that the territory needed good legal minds protecting the rights of people who were being systematically deprived of them, and that she was one of the best legal minds he had encountered, and that the bar examination was a formality relative to the expertise she already possessed. She sat the examination in the fall of 1885. She passed it with the highest score recorded in the territory that year, which she noted to Jonas and then set aside as a fact rather than an achievement, because what mattered was not the score but what came after it. What came after it was the opening of Shelton and Trask. She kept the Shelton name for the practice, both because it was the name under which her reputation had been built, and because her father deserved to have his name on the work that his careful documentation had made possible. Jonas was, technically, a co-name partner without legal credentials, which he found privately amusing and practically irrelevant, since his role in the practice was survey expertise and field documentation rather than legal analysis, and both of those functions were things he was doing anyway. The practice grew. In 3 years, it had handled 47 land dispute cases in the territory, winning 39 of them. Several of those cases involved communities, ranching families, farming settlements, a group of Apache landholders in the Chiricahua region whose ancestral territory had been claimed by a federal irrigation project on grounds that Maggie found legally tenuous and morally repugnant. That last case was the most difficult and the longest, and when it was eventually resolved in their favor, the most important. She did not win everything that should have been won. Some injustices were older than the mechanisms available to contest them, and she learned to hold those cases without letting them diminish the ones where there was room to fight and win. Jonas, who had his own history with losing what ought to be protected, understood this better than anyone else could have, and they talked about it honestly in the way they had learned to talk about things that were hard. Edmund, at 4, had a little sister, Frances Elaine Trask, who arrived in the spring of 1888 with considerably less difficulty than her brother had, and who was, from the first week of her life, a person of very clear preferences and remarkable patience in pursuing them. Edmund regarded Frances with the benign condescension of a firstborn child, and then, over the following year, with the genuine devotion of someone who had discovered that a small companion was an excellent thing. By the time Frances was 3 and Edmund was 6, they were, as Clara observed with great satisfaction, each other's most reliable co-conspirator. In 1889 they moved to the Callaway Flats Valley. It had been coming for several years. The mine management was solid, the land was productive, and the valley had begun to attract settlers in the years since the legal situation had been resolved. A small community of farming families and a few businesses that had grown around the employment and economic activity the mine created. The town that was beginning there was called Shelton, which Maggie had not proposed and was mildly embarrassed by, but which the residents insisted upon with a firmness she could not practically override without being ungracious about it. The house Jonas built for them, because he designed it himself, with the same care and specificity he brought to everything, was on the western edge of the valley where the ground was good, and the morning light came straight and clear across the flat land before the ridge caught it. It was a substantial house, 4 rooms and a proper kitchen, and a study where Maggie could work with the documents and correspondence that continued to be the primary material of her days, and a wide porch that faced south where they sat in the evenings when the day's work was done. The view from that porch was of the valley, the ridge above it, the town below it, the enormous sky that was different every evening and always magnificent. Maggie sat on that porch and looked at it and thought about the deed, the yellowed legal-stamped document her father had pressed into her hands in a St. Louis sickroom, the paper that had named a place no one had heard of, the thing that had brought her here. Edmund Shelton had bought that deed as an investment and never been able to claim it. He had spent 14 years maintaining records and preparing for a fight he was afraid to have. He had kept everything, the deed, the documentation, the letter to the land office, the careful chain of evidence that his daughter had used to do what he could not. She had come to find a town that did not exist and found something else entirely. She had found the land and the right and the man and the life. Jonas came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He had made the coffee because he was home from a 3-week survey trip in the Sulphur Springs Valley, and he made the coffee on the evenings he was home as a private way of marking the pleasure of it, and sat beside her in the other chair and looked at the same view. "Edmund told me today that he wants to be a surveyor," Jonas said. He told me yesterday he wants to be a lawyer, Maggie said. It's not a choice that needs to be made yet, Jonas said. I told him the same thing. He seemed to find it insufficient. Jonas smiled. He finds most things insufficient that do not give him an immediate decision to make. He gets that from his father, Maggie said. He gets that from his mother, Jonas said. They sat together with that easy disagreement between them, and the valley spread out below in the evening light. And after a moment, Jonas reached over and took her hand in a gesture that was so practiced and natural after 7 years that it was the gesture of people who have built something together and know its weight. Frances came running out of the house because Frances was always running. She was a child in motion at all times, and she climbed onto Jonas's lap and demanded to be shown a star she had decided was hers, which Jonas obliged with complete seriousness, pointing out the star she had chosen, Venus, though Maggie did not correct this, and explaining to her how people navigated by stars, which was a subject he knew a great deal about, and which Frances listened to with the focused intensity she gave to things that interested her, and the complete absence of patience she gave to things that did not. Edmund appeared in the doorway to announce that he had read the document she had left on her desk, a land registry filing for a case in the Gila River Valley, and that he had a question about the notarial requirements, which was a sentence so precisely characteristic of the child that both his parents looked at each other over Frances's head. The evening went on in the way evenings go in houses where people are busy and happy and have figured out how to be honest with each other. Later, when Edmund and Frances were in their beds and the valley was dark and the stars were the real stars and not diplomatic approximations, Maggie and Jonas sat on the porch in the particular quiet that comes after children are asleep. I have been thinking about the Gila River case, Maggie said. Jonas said. It is going to require survey work. The physical boundary documentation is incomplete. I know, he said. I read your notes. She looked at him sideways. You read my case notes. You leave them on the kitchen table, he said. It is difficult not to read them. He paused. Also, they are interesting. She shook her head, but she was smiling. The survey work is going to take you away for 3 weeks at minimum. Probably 4, he said. I know I do not like it. Nor do I, she said, but it is important. Yes, he said. They were quiet for a moment. Jonas, she said, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had simply introduced yourself honestly that first day, on the street in Redemption Creek? He thought about it, genuinely considered it with that thoughtfulness he brought to questions that deserved it. I think, he said finally, that you would have walked away from me, and I think I would have found another way to approach you, and it would have been worse the second time. And eventually we would have arrived at the same place because the situation required it. That is a very long way of saying you think the outcome was inevitable. I think we were inevitable, he said quietly. I think there was something between us from the first moment that was going to resolve into this one way or another, but I still wish I had been honest. Not because it would have changed the outcome, because you deserved it. She looked at the valley. She looked at the stars. She looked at him. You have been honest since, she said. Relentlessly, sometimes inconveniently honest. You told me I had taken on the Gila River case too soon before the Chiricahua matter was fully resolved, and you were right, and I did not enjoy hearing it. You thanked me afterward. Reluctantly. He laughed, the low, genuine laugh she had first heard on their wedding day and had never tired of. He squeezed her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not a thing she had ever done easily with anyone and now did with him as naturally as breathing. The valley was dark and quiet below them. The Callaway Flats mine, not called that anymore, called the Shelton mine on the official registry, was still. The lights of the small town were the particular warm yellow of oil lamps in windows, the specific light of people settled into their evenings. She thought about the deed, which was now filed in the tombstone registry as part of the complete and legally settled record of the Shelton property, no longer pressed against her heart in a traveling coat, but archived with the permanence of a resolved thing. She thought about her father's careful hands pressing it into hers, and about the town that did not exist on any current map, and about the man who had said he would help her find it. He had helped her find it. He had helped her find everything, in the way people help each other find things, not by leading, but by walking alongside with their own light, illuminating things that would have been visible eventually, but came into focus faster because of the company. She thought that Edmund Shelton, wherever he was, would have approved. She also thought, with the specific quiet certainty of someone who has stopped needing to be certain about it because it simply is, that this was the life. Not a version of a life she was settling for, not a life built around limitations, not a life defined by what she had lost or what she had been afraid of. The life, the actual, full, specific, irreplaceable thing. "Maggie," Jonas said. "Yes," she said, without lifting her head from his shoulder. "I want to say something without managing how I say it or timing it for the right moment." She smiled. He had been saying that to her for years. Each time he said something important, it had become their private language for "I am going to be completely honest with you right now." "Say it," she said. "I am grateful every day," he said. "For the deed and the ghost town and the robbery outside Tucson and the forged abandonment and all of it. For all of the things that had to happen to put you on that street in Redemption Creek, with something in your satchel that people were willing to commit crimes to take. I am grateful for all of it because it brought you here." Maggie was quiet for a moment in the good way. "The deed named a town no one had heard of," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you said you would help me find it." "Yes," he said. "You did," she said. "You helped me find everything." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and the Arizona night was enormous and clear around them, and the stars were doing the ancient patient work of being brilliant. And in the house behind them, their children were sleeping in the deep, trustful way that children sleep when the world around them is safe and constant and good. The deed had named a town no one had heard of, and she had arrived with it in a place that felt like nowhere, and a man with gray-green eyes and a hidden agenda and an essentially decent heart had said he would help her find it. He had kept that promise and broken the hidden agenda and told her the truth when it cost him something, and she had trusted him slowly and completely and had not regretted a single day of it. Callaway Flats had been a ghost, but what they had built in its valley was real and solid and theirs, documented and proper and protected the way her father had always said it should be. The way the law was only just when someone insisted that it be. She insisted. He stood beside her, and the life they had built on that insistence was the best kind of deed, the kind that did not need to be pressed against anyone's heart to be real, because it was already written in everything around them and in every day that came after.